बस. So good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. This is Rudra Narayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. We are proud to announce that this conference is conducted along with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, Odisha. I welcome our speaker for today, Professor Usha Raman from the University of Hyderabad, and participants across the globe through Facebook and YouTube Live, and who are here to listen, Professor Raman. The broader theme of this conference is agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to the patrons of this World Symposia, Professor Dr. Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Professor Dr. Sarath Kumar Pallita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Nayak, Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University. The convener of this largest virtual conference, eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahi ji. The main outcome of this conference is to come up with the national and international framework for the education system in future. The crux of this conference will be the use of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and virtual reality that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID. We hope this conference would help the students, faculties, researchers, and all to expand their mental horizon and help the education system to adopt the best. Dear friends, the Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. The prime agenda of this institution is to come up with a potential policy solutions for the social change while believing in the idea of 3D and E3. 3D stand for debate, dialogue, and discussion, and with E3 stand for expertise, experiencing, and education. The institution focus on marginalized communities and work for their livelihood to protect the nature, culture, language, and identity. In particular, the age of modernity has witnessed the change is the only constant phenomenon for the social purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodological and avoids paradoxically framework which neglected so many centuries from theory to become practice. The Center for Adivasi Research and Development sincerely believe in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and build new social entrepreneurship for check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. Center for Adivasi Research and Development come to serve with the holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps, to plan accordingly for the voiceless communities. Ladies and gentlemen, in this evening, we have with us one of the finest communication professor of India, Professor Usha Raman ji. Professor Usha Raman is the Professor of Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad. Her research interests include cultural studies of science, health communication, children's media, feminist media studies, and the socio and cultural impact of digital media. Before joining the university, Professor Raman headed the communications department at LV Prasad Eye Institute. She has written for the popular press on topics related to health, technology, women issues, education, and digital culture. Her writing has appeared in the Indian Express, Caravan, Deccan Chronicle, and the Times of India. She currently is a columnist for the Hindu and edits a monthly magazine for school teachers. The name is Teachers Plus. Professor Usha received her doctorate in mass communication from the University of Georgia, Athens, United States. In 1996, she has been a visiting fellow at the University of Sydney, MIT, United States, and University of Bremen, Germany. Most recently, her work has focused on civic engagement and digital social network and feminist digital methodologies. Apart from several books, chapters, and journal articles on her core research areas, her publications including writing for the media from Oxford University Press, a volume from poetry entitled All the Spaces in Between, and the children's books on a children's book Under the Bed on India. Here is Professor Usha Raman is ready to enlighten us, and Professor Raman will be talk about the possibilities and pulse of online social movements. Now, I would like to invite Professor Raman to initiate her talk. Over to you, Professor Raman.
Thank you so much for that very elaborate introduction. It's always a little bit embarrassing to hear that. But thanks to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. And I believe that I follow several very illustrious speakers, so it's a bit humbling. I hope I have something to say that will be of interest to the audience. So let me just take a minute to start my presentation. Okay, so I hope everyone can see the slides. Yeah. So what I thought I would talk about was, something that, of course, all of us today are engaged with, right? I mean, every time you open your email or check your notifications on WhatsApp or Facebook, you find that somebody somewhere is asking you to support a movement, to contribute to a movement, to forward the message, and so on. So I think digital activism, digital social movements have become part of our culture these days. And the kinds of movements that you see are quite varied, right? I mean, in terms of environmental movements, civic movements, political movements, cultural movements. So you see all kinds of movements happening in the social media space and in the digital space more broadly. So there's a lot of what I might call cynicism around this. And there are people who say, oh, this is just slacktivism. I'm sure many of you have heard that term, where it becomes easy for us to engage or pretend to engage by just clicking on a like or forwarding something or signing a petition and so on. But I would like to take the position in this talk that it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the fact that we are occupying this digital space and engaging with things in a certain way, it's not necessarily just slacktivism. I think there's something more to it. And of course, there is a percentage of people who are not really engaging with the content, but at the same time, there are many people who are seriously engaging with these movements and with these online movements. So I think I would like to take a slightly more hopeful attitude in this talk, and we'll see. I mean, I'm open to questions and confrontations after I speak. So I'd like to start with actually a personal story, and this is something very recent. Just 2 weeks ago on Diwali, just before Diwali, actually, a week before Diwali, we, a part of a group that I am a part of, decided to try and organize an event. And this event was actually part of a longer movement that we have been engaged with, which is trying to look at the biodiversity of urban spaces and looking to see how one can protect that biodiversity in the face of very large scale development, real estate development, cutting down of trees, destroying. In Hyderabad, for instance, we have these huge, beautiful boulders, and they've been indiscriminately just destroyed. And so the landscape has become, in many places, treeless, flat, quite barren. So this particular movement, I think, illustrates in a way the possibilities of online engagement. We started out as a very small group that was just interested in nature, doing walks, looking at trees, and so on. And then it became larger and larger. It was mostly word of mouth. And then somebody said, why not start a WhatsApp group? And it was still fairly apolitical. It was just a group interested in nature. And then when we heard about this stretch of banyan trees along one of the highways outside Hyderabad, around more than 1,000 trees were going to be cut down for road expansion. And these are trees which were more than 100 years old. So we decided that we have this group of some 200 and odd people, just a group on WhatsApp, but why don't we use this group to actually become a pressure lobby? So we created an online petition. The petition garnered something like 49,000 signatures, and entirely because it was spread on digital media and through Facebook and WhatsApp and email, of course. And I'm not saying that the development was stopped because of the petition, but the petition certainly created a public awareness and possibly could have been one of the factors that was taken into account by the government. And so the development was halted. Now what we find is that the development has started up again, and we've revived the campaign. And because we have access to all the people who signed the petition, we have a ready-made public, let's say, that will engage with us in trying to expand this protest. And I've got on the slide, you'll see this comment that says the power of 3.5%. And this is something that comes from a lot of research on environmental movements. And you may have heard of groups like Fridays for Future, for instance, right? That is trying to bring awareness around climate change and global warming. Now, the theory is, and this has been tested across many studies, particularly in environmental movements, is that what you need for a campaign to succeed is 3.5% of the population to engage. So 3.5% in the context of India is a huge number. But if you think about, let's say, a small colony or a city, maybe it's an achievable goal. So I'd like you to just keep that in mind. 3.5% of the population, how does one reach them? Is it possible to reach that kind of percentage through other means? Or does the digital space give us this additional ammunition to try and reach larger groups? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So some of the basic questions that we have to think about when we talk about social media campaigns or online campaigns is, fundamentally, particularly in the last year or so, or last 1.5 years during the pandemic, we've realized that all our socialization, or much of our socialization, has moved into the digital space. So what is this social space that we occupy? So it's important for us to consider or redefine, think about what do we mean by the social, and how do networks operate? So these questions that I have up here are the kinds of questions that we need to think about when we try and understand what do social media campaigns mean, what do social media movements mean, what kind of potential do they have, and what kind of limitations do they have. So to understand the nature of the digital, to understand the nature of networks on digital spaces, and the ways in which we engage with them. And I think we've learned a lot about this in the past 18 months of the pandemic, when life has kind of, as they say, pivoted onto the social media space. And over the past decade or so, we're seeing that there are different kinds of political involvement that has become possible because of the internet. Now, whether you talk about the gig economy or consumer behavior online, we're seeing a lot of new things which don't seem very new anymore, but certainly they're new in terms of if you look at the broad sweep of history. So since the early 2000s, let's say, our life has really changed because of the internet. So I think it's important also that we make a difference, or we try and distinguish between the different kinds of campaigns that we see online. So you have, of course, a lot of online politics and different kinds of politics, right? So it could be like Twitter wars, it could be people having discussions online, it could be forums like this where you have, instead of a large rally, you have a webinar or a public webinar, and so on. So online politics has taken on, or politics has moved online in many ways. So it could simply be political discussion, but it could also be political mobilization. So through WhatsApp, for instance, you have voting drives, or you get a reminder from your local councillor saying, today is voting day, come and vote. So there's a certain kind of politics that has become possible because of digital spaces. And then you have social movements. So while political movements are more about party politics and electoral politics, social movements are more about changing society, or trying to change social norms, or promote pro-social behavior, and so on. And then you have civic engagement, which is a little bit different in the sense that civic engagement has to do with governance, whether governments or public bodies are doing the work that they're supposed to do, and is it possible for us as citizens to actually keep an eye on it, get engaged with it, help governments do their jobs better, and so on. So there is civic engagement, and then you have campaigns of multiple kinds. So you have campaigns that are very short term. So let's say there's an election going to be held in a week or 2 weeks or a few months. You have a lot of groups that are trying to get people out to vote. So there is political mobilization where you're trying to get people to vote for a particular party. But then there's also civic mobilization, which is trying to just get people to go out and exercise their vote. So you have short-term mobilization, which is aimed at very specific goals, short-term goals. And then you have sustained campaigns. And I'll give you a few examples of those, but sustained engagement is for longer, broader kinds of change. So if you think about, gender sensitization, or getting people to reduce, reuse, recycle for environmental purposes, those things are not over in a day, they're not over in a month or even in a year. So these are things that require people to engage over a long term. So, so you have this kind of, these kinds of distinctions. And I think the online space works very differently for each kind of engagement online. So what we've done, I'm not going to spend too much time on the theory, but I just wanted to have it up here because I know many of the people in the audience are social scientists, probably, looking at these issues from a more theoretical or academic standpoint. So just to give you a little bit of the theory that informs online social movements and studies of online social movements. So there's a whole body of scholarship that's been looking at how citizenship has changed. And earlier we would think of a good citizen as being somebody who was well aware of the responsibilities of citizenship and the rights of citizenship. So someone who is informed. And then you move to the kind of citizen who not only is informed, but also makes sure that things are happening. So, you have people making sure that if a particular political party had certain ideas on their manifesto, that they would also actually live up to those promises. So a monitorial citizen is one that keeps track of these things. And then you have the engaged citizen who is not only informed and keeps track, but also actively engages. So you can think of, residents associations, for instance, right? Where there may be a group of people who actively ensures that people are segregating their waste, or that when there is an election happening, that they go door to door and ask people to make sure that they go and vote. So you have a whole spectrum of this, and there's a lot of work in political science and public administration that looks at how citizenship has changed over time, and particularly how it's been affected by digital media. And all of these studies, I think, go beyond what I call slacktivism, at the beginning of the talk. And they go to suggest that there are now different kinds of engagement that become possible in the digital realm. So, you want to be engaged, you don't have the time, you don't have the energy, you can simply sign a petition and forward it. So that is what we call thin engagement. But let's say you are you have time, energy, you have a good network, you also want to give talks about something, or you actually create a petition and disseminate it. So all the way from thin engagement where you simply click and forward, to thick engagement where you not only create petitions, but maybe you also go out onto the streets and protest, lobby with governing officials and so on. So there's a whole spectrum of engagement that the online space allows. And the online space, one very important aspect of online digital or digital activism is what we call the amplification of voice. It allows people who earlier did not have a voice to acquire a voice very inexpensively. So all you need is a phone and a network connection, and you can actually broadcast to the world. So this becomes very important in online social movements. And what I call here instrumentalism is that on the one hand, you have voice, that is, simply the ability to speak and express, but you also have the ability to influence. And not everybody, but you can acquire influence. So we've all seen on Instagram, for instance, there are people that we call influencers, and these are people who have acquired a certain a perception of value in that space. So you believe them. An influencer in, let's say, the fashion industry is somebody whose tastes are respected and followed. So all the way from simple self-expression to actual influence, you have, again, a spectrum. And the last point that I have on this slide, where I say that scholars have found that there is a strategic value both to people who are at the periphery, that is the people who simply click and forward, and of course to people who are actually engaging in thick engagement. And you need both kinds, right? So you may need the drop that goes into the pool to create the ripple, but then you need the energy of the outward ripples to actually get that message out. So both things become important. Excuse me. In digital culture, we often talk about the affordances of technology. And what that means simply is that technology allows for certain things to happen and it limits certain things. So if we think about what are the affordances or what are the advantages of social media or networked media, what it allows us to do is it allows us to create a community of interest. So think about Facebook groups. There are so many kinds of Facebook groups, right? Or even on Twitter, which is more of a broad-based platform, you have academic Twitter, you have education Twitter, you have pop culture Twitter, you have political Twitter. So you have these possibilities of creating communities of interest. And once you have a community of interest, you can actually mobilize that community and speak to their conscience. So if I'm talking about the tree group that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, we had a group that shared a common interest in nature. They were not particularly political, but then the moment there was a campaign or a need for support, we were able to activate that group of 250 people and then expand it because we were able to appeal to conscience. So in this manner, you're able to create an assembly of opinion, which starts out as a simple interest group and then grows into something more. And the examples I have here are from avaz.com. many of you may know about Avaz. It's an online activist organization that primarily works through petitions. And so they create petitions mostly around environmental issues, and they try and use that petition-based movement to influence leaders, people in decision-making positions. So you have a variety of organizations that attempt to create these communities of interest and then use them to convert them into assemblies of opinion. And you have it across all kinds of social movements. And we find, some of the research I've done points to the fact that while it's very easy to create a petition around, let's say, save something or, don't do something, it's much harder to create a petition that is about much deep-rooted cultural or social norms. So if you're talking about gender norms or norms around caste or those kinds of things, it's very difficult to do that simply with petitions, and you need different kinds of strategies for that. So I think it's useful also to think about the scale of networks and how social media or social media campaigns, both for civic, political, and also for social movements, they work or don't work depending on what the scale is, right? So, and I'll show you some examples in the subsequent slides, but they can go all the way from hyper-local. So just to give you an example, in my colony, we have a WhatsApp group, and one of the things I've been trying to push is, to get people to segregate waste, of course, and to think, to be a little more mindful about how they segregate their waste. And so then I could use the WhatsApp group to send daily reminders, to tell them how to do things, so on and so forth. So that becomes hyper local. And then you radiate outwards, right? Depending on the kind of issue you're working with, you can go all the way to global. And of course, you can also have institutional movements. So if you think about Greta Thunberg and her movement, which started out very locally. I mean, what she was doing was sitting outside the Swedish parliament every Friday, skipping school, because she wanted to bring attention to the problem of climate change. Now, something that started at a local level has grown into something that is, really global. And you have Fridays for Future movements across the world, all inspired by something that was extremely local. So the digital, again, allows us to operate at different levels of scale. And I think that's important to recognize. So just to give you some examples of hyper-local or very local campaigns, I'm sure many of you have seen on your WhatsApp feeds or Facebook feeds, a puppy goes missing and you immediately get a forward saying, if you've seen this pup or if you've seen this dog anywhere, please let the owners know. Or you may get a call for, is anyone willing to adopt? So this happens at a very local scale and around communities of interest. So you may have a group that's, a pet lovers group or something, and you work within those groups. The second campaign that I have here was a campaign in Bangalore. Very active campaign. They started out on Facebook and then went offline and managed to create so much interest on Facebook that quite a lot of people in Bangalore showed up at the site to protest the demolition of a heritage structure. So you move from local and you create an interest that actually goes national, and then that creates pressure on the local. So these kinds of campaigns would be very difficult to do without the digital, is what I'm arguing. So you have communities of interest, and you try and move those communities of interest into communities of practice. And some of you may remember that some years ago we had this thing called the Als Ice Bucket Challenge. It went viral on social media, particularly on Facebook. And the challenge was to bring awareness to this condition called ALS. And by pouring a bucket of ice over your head, it was supposed to mimic the physical sensation that people with ALS had, and therefore create empathy and motivate people to donate to the cause. So one of and it was an extremely successful challenge on social media. So one of the journalists in Hyderabad, what she said was, well, ALS is not that big an issue in India, but hunger is. So she used the ice bucket challenge and turned it into the rice bucket challenge. And she said, can you just donate a bucket of rice and we will distribute it to the needy? So not only does this allow people to engage with these kinds of issues, but it gives them a good feeling by being able to show that they are engaged. So you may have heard a lot about performativity online, and performance, some people dismiss it, but I would say performance is not a bad thing. And if it makes people feel good and makes them do better, if they show that they're doing good, then so what? So she would say, okay, donate rice and also post a picture of yourself donating that rice or giving it to me, that is, whoever was collecting it. So it's the performance of socially conscious citizenship. The other thing that I wanted to talk about just very briefly is that, the critique of social media movements is that it's very superficial. But as we've seen with the rice bucket challenge, it doesn't have to be superficial. So, okay, you're posting a selfie of yourself donating rice, but you've donated the rice, right? And if the performance of it is what motivates you to do, I think it's hard to argue that it's a bad thing. So similarly, the other thing that happens on social media a lot is to very quickly raise awareness around issues. So if we think about what has happened in the past year and a half with COVID, you'll find that a lot of people who who had COVID, who had symptoms, or were trying to find answers to questions that they had, would post on social media, and immediately a community of support would come forward with information, ideas, resources, etc. We saw this happen with the oxygen cylinder shortage, and how people were sharing information and resources. So the performance of informed citizenship or engaged citizenship becomes possible, and possibly prompts other people also to share their information and resources. How are we doing on time? Yeah. So moving on, so we talked about performance, we talked about engagement, and one way in which engagement and performance comes together on social media is to show that you're engaged. And just like showing that you do good, I think showing that you're engaged and informed also, I think, allows us to overcome the alienation we often feel in today's, very sort of distanced society. So again, this is an old picture from the last election. But every time there's an election, particularly if it's a national, central government election, you find that people want to say that, I'm a conscious citizen and I am engaged and I do go out and vote. So you had this phenomenon of what became called felfies, finger selfies. So people show their, inked fingers. And I think, if somebody does this in the morning, someone that they know may be prompted to go out and vote in the afternoon. So again, it has a ripple effect and has a positive ripple effect. And I've already talked about this, the fact that, both core and periphery are important, and sometimes it matters who is at that core. So this example comes from, again, a campaign that happened a few years ago the campaign was driven largely by, the Usha Foundation, although river interlinking is not their idea, but they were able to really rally a lot of support for the movement. And rally is a pun in that way. They had these on-ground movements, and they had a lot of online motivation building and so on. And it, of course, this ties in with other kinds of campaigns where you have a famous person or a well-respected person driving the campaign. But that person alone is not enough, right? You need social media warriors, you need on-the-ground warriors. So this is just to reiterate that you need both a committed core and an enthusiastic periphery. And this periphery becomes possible on social media. If you were only building a periphery with boots on the ground, it becomes difficult because it takes time to go from place to place physically. But on social media, it becomes a little bit more easy. So just to summarize, online citizenship and its performance. And when I say citizenship, it's not just in the political sense, but also people who are civic minded and engaged in a civic manner. It allows for multiple kinds of performance. So you can perform concern, you can perform being critical or dissenting, as we saw in the CAA protests. You can demonstrate care, as we saw with the rice bucket challenge. You can inform knowledge, you can perform knowledge and being informed by sharing information on social media. And of course, you can also perform being active. So social media allows you to actually visualize or make visible your citizenship in multiple ways. So that makes it a space where we can feel like we are engaged and show that we are engaged. So again, it allows us to show that we know and so on. This is just a repetition of what I said earlier. And these are all the actions that we perform to show that we care, we know, we are interested, and so on. Yeah. So if we're to think about social media as a civic space, I think what becomes particularly interesting about it is that it allows us to link the personal with the political, link the personal with the popular, etc. So if you think about how memes are created, right? So memes are a very interesting form of expression. They're intensely political in many ways or cultural, but they always have this little personal, the possibility of making it personal. So the whole project of memification is you take something that exists in popular culture and you do something with it that expresses your own take on that event. So, whether it is, Modi memes or if you remember that very popular Bernie Sanders meme that went around. So everyone feels like they can take this and make it their own and use it to make a statement. So that's something that is, I think, unique to social media, which allows us to combine a very personal aesthetic or a very personal form of expression with something that everybody understands, whether it is political or civic or social. It allows us to combine opinion with fact, and this could be dangerous. And I'll just talk briefly about that in a minute. As I said, it allows us to build communities of interest and turn them into communities of practice. And some of you may have heard about this notion of the long tail, which is in marketing, it's used to signify the idea that a product can have a long tail on the internet because of the way the internet works, right? So something that is old can be revived on the internet very easily and create new audiences. So similarly, you can bring back interest in an issue by simply reposting it or reposting it in a different group or putting it in a different network and so on. So you can keep an issue alive in multiple ways in much more simple modes than you could online. And I think this last point that I have here, that is social media, really helps us address the sense of helplessness we feel, right? I mean, there are big problems in the world today, whether you're talking about poverty or hunger or the divide in education, in digital access, climate change. So sometimes all of us feel quite a bit overwhelmed, and we feel like there's nothing we can do about it. But then a petition comes along and asks us to sign and pass it on, and you feel a little bit like maybe we're doing something to be engaged. So it helps us engage with the discourse, feel like we are participating. And I think that is also quite important in a democracy, right? Not only should you be informed, but you should have various means of engaging with ideas, engaging with people, engaging with processes. So, several other movements one can analyze in the same way and see what has worked, what has not worked, how have they built publics, how have they brought people together. And I think all of these movements have relied quite a lot on the digital media. Again, just to again repeat the point that during the past year and a half, we've realized that connection is important, and the digital, if not for the digital space, I think all of us would have felt much worse than we did. Of course, the digital space also created anxieties, but I think in some, it's given us meaningful ways to connect. It's allowed us to be both civic actors and social actors. You don't have to go to a different place to be, a social actor. You can be on this window, engage socially, but also engage in civic ways. And I think it's important for us to think, how has the internet really made us, has it made us disconnected or has it made us connected? That may be an individual question, but I think the potential for connection has certainly increased. So I'm going to end with just this one summary slide. To recognize that there are also perils. I mean, I've been talking mostly about the promise and the potential, but of course there are perils. The fact that I started out by saying that slacktivism is a very dismissive term, and maybe we need to rethink it. It's also true that for some people, it's enough to engage at that level. So the effort for people who are engaged in campaigns and want to mobilize is to find out what it is that will push that person from simply performing citizenship to actually being engaged. To design their campaigns in a way that pushes engagement rather than simply performance. So what I've put up here on this slide are some of the perils. It's difficult to control message, it's easy to distort the message, and so on. And of course, there is also the issue of surveillance. And if you study campaigns, you'll find that surveillance can sometimes be a big limitation. And of course, to connect consciously with on-ground activities. So I think it's important for campaigns to recognize both the promise and the perils, and to use social media in the way that will maximize the promise and downplay the perils. So I will stop there. I'm sorry, I think I spoke for a little longer than I had hoped, but I hope I made sense. So shall I stop sharing?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for such a enlightening discussion, which is the topic is currently the need of the hour. Now, today we have all known that the globalization has brought us in an infotech world, that so far as the information communication is concerned, and now the social media activism is the need of the hour to brought a drastic social change. Because we have been seen through a PPT that the way you have projected the digital social movement using the social media platforms to protect the banyan trees from due to the road expansion project. It shows that that we need a solidarity that to protect the climate crisis, the climate change that which has been drastically taking place, and it's need support from the below, from the grassroots to the top level. And now it is only can be possible through the social media platform, because it is a connecting more people than the physical connectivity, because it is a cost effective, and we can reach a larger audience for the for our noble cause or for our noble purpose. And the rice bucket challenge is a very powerful and strong campaign in terms of, if you think, to wipe out hunger, to wipe out the starvation. If we can see that it is not so much that the way we think, but it may be a little this little attempt can brought a certain amount of changes in the society. And we can say that despite having there are so much criticism or superficial criticism, the digital social movement is essential required to protect the interest of the most of the marginalized sections of our society. Those voices have been never heard through the propaganda machinery of the state, and those needs the attention throughout this society. And today we are also facing that we have already said about the way climate change. The debate of Anthropocene is now at forefront. The way that human behavior has an increasing impact not over only the lives of the planetary lives, the life world is also in a challenge. And which seriously looking at the way that we need to consider this. So I think that this online social movement campaign can brought a potential solution to the major problems that we face today in terms of poverty, hunger, poor healthcare system or education system, whatever we say. Thank you, madam, for enlightening us today. There are a couple of questions. Shall I take all the questions one after one for you?
Okay. Yeah, I've been looking at the chat, and I just wanted to make the point, if I could, that, obviously, when we talk about online social movements, it is not a substitute for on the ground. It is only an amplification. So you absolutely need on-ground movements. You need physically engaged movements. But social media movements can become an additional layer that can give more power to those movements. Yeah, so please go ahead. Do you want to choose the questions?
Yes, ma'am. I'm just reading one after one question for you. Dr. Bikram Kesar Jana asks, madam, if you believe in the theory of Habermas, then in contemporary realities, what is important context, communities or content, or even more largely the communication particularly?
So if I get the question right, if we think about, the Habermasian public sphere, or, if you also want to talk about Habermas's theory of communicative action, I think, all of these things become important, right? I mean, one of the reasons some social media movements don't succeed is because they are too decontextualized. So the best kind of social media movement is one that allows for localization of a universal message. So if you think about something like Me Too, now #MeToo was, in some ways, that's kind of a fundamental movement, right? Because gender relations or gender politics across the world are similar, but the scale may be different, and the ways in which gender politics works out may be different. So, but #MeToo worked because the fundamental power relationships between the genders is the same across the world. But it allowed different groups, like in India, the way #MeToo worked, it was very different, right, in India. So it allowed people to create, to take this hashtag and look at it in the context of academia, for instance, or in the context of the media industry, or in the context of cinema, or in the context of politics. So the hashtag worked because it allowed for that kind of adaptation. So going back to the Habermasian question, I think there is a consciousness that publics may be different across the world. And if you're to have a successful social media movement, it should be one that recognizes what is universal and what is contextual, and allow those who are taking on this campaign at local levels to adapt it without losing the essence of the overall campaign. So so context is of course important. You cannot ignore context.
And there is another question from him. What is, ma'am, what is your observation in using social media or the age of digital medium, the changing behavior of electoral experience of political society, or the new framework of young minds to be a part of the political multiplicity?
Not so sure I understand the question.
Also a phrase, perception or perspective and narrations or narratives. What would you believe in the age of digital culture to enhance knowledge society through mass media related to information or possibilities propaganda theory of fall campaign to avoid realities in post-truth world order?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite complicated, right? In the sense that what we're seeing is that while social media or internet broadly allows us to become better informed, what we sometimes lack is the ability to discern between different kinds of information. And as you're suggesting, to discern between what is knowledge and what is propaganda. So, which suggests that our efforts, as educators and as people who understand media, I think we need to move our efforts further down in the education ladder. So I think right from primary school, we need to include more media literacy. We need to give children and young people the critical skills that will allow them to question what they read and what they see, and try and find out what the real source is. Because how do you know that something is propaganda? You only know that something is propaganda if you've been exposed to other sources of information. But if right from when you're young, you're only exposed to one particular stream of information, you don't even recognize that it is propaganda. So I think we need to, as media educators, we need to start engaging in media literacy activities right from school itself, so that by the time young people come to electoral age, or are able to become voters or civic actors, they already have the critical skills to discern between information and propaganda. And I think
Yes.
that also addresses the previous question
Yes,
to some
yes,
extent. Yeah.
Another question is, what is your ideas on societies like a political society, civil society, or the moral society, or even cultural society and village society? Which one is more important to enhance knowledge society, particularly in fundamental ethics of beyond disciplinary practice?
So I think, the way we think about these different, so what you're calling political, civil, moral society, etc., in some ways it is the same society that is functioning in different ways. So if we think about a community, whether it is at the village level or at the city level or at the national level, it is basically the same group of people that forms a political society in one instance and forms civil society in another instance, or operates in a certain common moral framework in another instance. So, and ethics, I guess, will run across all of this. So I think ethics has to be not only beyond disciplinary practice, but it also has to be beyond context. So I think we need to somehow find a way of building ethical understanding, ethical reasoning, ethical practice again into education, right from primary level, because I think very often we leave some of these more important things to tertiary level education. And by then, our ethical selves are already formed. So instead of spending so much time in schools teaching content, like right now we are teaching content, instead we should be teaching logic, we should be teaching critical thinking, we should be teaching ethics. And once we have that foundation, it doesn't matter what kind of activity space you're in, whether it is political or civil action or culture, you will be able to apply an ethical standard.
Yes, ma'am. Now now the forum is open for the participants. Whoever wants to interact, please directly ask question.
So somebody has said
Yes, ma'am. I'm just
social media
reading.
creates, yeah.
No doubt this social media creates a space or a social movement which is helpful for today's generation. Don't you think that this movement to need to be for political issues? And yeah, of course I have seen some, but somehow we all know that the arguing person gets termed as anti-national if this statement gets viral, and then the person faces a lot of problems. So we can say the politicians are too controlling the social media, and we did not have any rights to argue on social media too, and they clearly guarantees freedom of speech, but they can't guarantee freedom after speech. So don't you think that we need to bring some reformation to liberalize media basis now? Because madam, the also now the new IT Act also restrict the use of media. Then what is your opinion, please?
Yeah, no, I think the new IT rules are still new, so we don't know how they're going to play out. But if you also look at, in parallel, this whole discussion around Facebook, right, and the new revelations, the Facebook files, as they are calling them, the revelations that the Facebook algorithm actually more deeply polarizes the user base, and it tends to privilege misinformation and so on. So I think, again, I think social media companies, of course, we need rules that will allow for freedom of expression and all of that. But I think these new media companies also bear a responsibility to ensure that their platforms are not abused. And how we do this, is this going to be done through algorithmic control, or is it going to be done by more sensitive moderators, human moderators? I mean, these are things that I think will have to be worked out. But one thing we are understanding based on the Facebook files is that you cannot leave some kinds of arbitration to algorithms. Artificial intelligence is still, I mean, of course, it's not artificial intelligence, it's algorithms, which is still different. But we still need human moderation. We need human, ethical understanding. In terms of, how people use social media and what goes viral and what doesn't go viral, again, I think that goes back to, and I know it sounds like a spoiled record when I keep saying media literacy, but if we understand why something is going viral, then we may question our belief in it, right? So the moment we know that, all these forwards, like I think now a lot of us are much more savvy about WhatsApp. We know that if it says forwarded many times, we should probably not trust it, or we should look for the source. So I think, again, it goes back to us being aware of how these media work, and then using that knowledge to demand from politicians or from policymakers that we need a free, open, and fair media space.
Yes, ma'am. I have one question, that even after the 75 years of 75 years of independence, we still continue some of the draconian laws. If you perceive the IPC 124 section A, we also the reasonable restriction, the phrase reasonable restriction under the article 19, that also throttle the freedom or the freedom of the people. Even people are getting frightened if they go for any digital campaign or the social media campaign, they might be get arrested or they might face some of the political compulsion. So what you look at it, what is the potential solution to it? If someone trying to do a digital movement, these are the barriers. How to overcome these barriers?
Yeah, no, that is, I mean, we are at a particularly problematic point, in our country's history, I guess. I mean, if you look at the case of Disha Ravi, for instance, right? I mean, something that seemed very simple, all she was doing was sharing what is called a toolkit, and that was deemed as being criminal activity. So I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but I think one way to subvert law is to keep breaking it. And if it happens at a large scale, then at some point the Supreme Court is going to say that the law is what needs to be changed, not people. So I mean, as has happened in the case of other laws, I mean, the pace of change is very slow in our country, and but you only have to keep hoping that it will change.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Now I'm inviting Professor Shravan Bag for a vote of thanks and closing remark.
Thank you so much, Shubham. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shubham. Well, it is always pleasure to have such a vibrant voice to listen on such an auspicious day. And as we all know, that today is a remarkable day as far as the education of this country is concerned. And we all know that education is the first and foremost tool to, eradicate illiteracy, ignorance. And on this auspicious day, to have Professor Usha Raman with us is always something like Sone Pe Suhaga. So thank you so much, Professor Usha Raman, ma'am, for your insightful talk and effort to make citizen informed and make a decision consciously by emphasizing the propositions like I'm socially conscious citizen, performance of informed citizenship, and of course at the end part you have tried to give a very clear-cut picture of how to differentiate what is knowledge and what is propaganda. So it was absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure that all our participants must have been enlightened from this talk. And to conclude, as you have rightly said, ma'am, certainly social media has brought a huge change the way community at large thinks and perceives to a context or incident. And sometimes this particular notion or this way of thinking creates a sort of tension and threats to the nation's sovereignty and destroys the richness of our cultural cohesion, particularly for a country like ours. Hence, I must say that it is very much important to channelize the energy of social media by connecting interest of communities, as you have rightly said, by amplifying voice and bring multiple interest of groups. So we at CARD are very much thankful for your time and consent to be a part of this discourse, ma'am. Thank you so much, and we would continue to seek your guidance and cooperation as well as your participation in the days to come, because we at CARD are always at a movement to bring change, positive change at the grassroots level by connecting community people at large. And I'm sure that you'll continue to give your insight and cooperation, ma'am, in the days to come. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all our mentors, our advisors, our partnering institutions, starting from IIM Sambalpur, Central University Koraput, and Ravenshaw University Cuttack, for taking this discourse to such an extent, which I'm sure that we all know is one of the very unique kind of discourse that is taking place at a large scale. So thank you all the partnering institutions, our mentors, for your support, for your guidance, and continually extending all sorts of resources and support. Last but not the least, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all participants who have joined through different social media platforms for making this discussion lively and participatory. I'm sure they will continue to share and participate the way they are doing last from more than 6 months. And we at CARD very much thankful to one and all, and we continue to look forward your kind participation and contribution in one or different forum and form. So with this notion and this thought, I'm leaving to our moderator. Thank you so much, Prof. Usha Raman ma'am, once again for giving us such an insightful deliberation. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your thank you for wonderful deliberation, ma'am, on social media.
Thank you so much, madam, and looking forward for future engagement.
Thank you. So I can leave the meeting now?
Yeah.
Thank you.